So, Christy, I'm just wondering how you felt about trauma-informed practices being applied at your school. Have you noticed an increase in identification of students with trauma symptoms?
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the things that I think that we've seen, or I've seen the biggest improvement in. In the past, I think, and coming from a counseling background, I know this, that sometimes we know that maybe a student is struggling with it, but we're not sure what that means or how to help them or what to do. And so I think what this has done is given us a lot more ability to not only identify, but to label and say, okay, this is a student who has had some trauma and we need to look at a different approach. And I think that now when we get new students or situations arise, I think the school as a whole is much better and quicker at identifying those students than we were in the past.
I agree. I think it's helped put a label or an identification on the student, because we would see those symptoms, but we didn't know what the underlying issue was. Mm-hmm. And so I think making the staff more aware, or if the staff heard anything that the student might be saying, then they would immediately know, oh, we might want to do some trauma interventions to help the student.
Yeah, and it gives us a direction. Even if we don't know exactly what to do, it gives us a direction. Okay, we need to start looking at how we can approach a student from a different perspective.
Okay, and so those tools helped.
I think absolutely. I think that's been one of the most impactful pieces at West Haven.
Okay. So another one of the components that we worked on educating the staff was making a connection with that student. One connection with a student that has experienced trauma can reverse all of the effects of trauma. Can you talk a little bit about maybe the shift you saw or things that the school approached differently in regards to connections with students or families?
Yeah, I think that we have gotten better at having that one connection, and oftentimes it's the classroom teacher. We know that comes more naturally to some teachers than to others, and so having the staff and other people aware has also been a big part of that too, because when a student is difficult day after day, sometimes that can wear on that teacher-student relationship. And so having that other person with a connection can and has made all the difference. Obviously, we want that in the classroom, but when there's been times where that hasn't worked, it's been good to have other people do it.
Yeah, so you've been able to have other people maybe compensate or step up so that student still feels connected to your school.
Yeah.
What about connections to parents? Do you feel like there's been a shift in that in regards?
Yeah, I would say next to awareness and identifying students, I would say that connection with families and helping them has been the second thing that we've gotten better at West Haven, the most influential. I know that many of the cases of our students who have really struggled, and we've been able to identify that need and we've seen them progress. I think that all of those cases probably are cases where we have been able to work with the family.
Yeah, I have to agree. I think that's probably one of the biggest things that I have learned and seen as a improvement is making that relationship. And one of the things that has been hard, but I think we've overcome somewhat, is parents that come in that are extremely, they might be difficult, they might be frustrated in their life circumstances, and to see them be able to communicate that to us and confide in us in some of the struggles that they're experiencing, I think that's been very helpful.
Yes, and it's helped us identify even more needs of the student that maybe we weren't able to identify prior to having that relationship and talking with the family. Because once the parents have learned to trust us and they've come in and been a part of, okay, how do we solve this together? How do we work as a team to help support the child in school, within the school building, not sending them home, not suspending them, we're supporting them here, then oftentimes the parents will start to disclose a little more about what the child's struggling with, or even what themselves as a parent has been struggling with. And I think that's another thing we see is that trauma of the parents. And oftentimes that's come across as argumentative or combative from
very
parent.
Defensive.
Yes,
very defensive and unwilling to open up. And we see that intergenerational trauma, and we've seen that in a couple of cases. I think the one of the cases that really hit me hard was the family that had been homeless quite often. I think that student had maybe been at 5 or 6 schools and was only in, I think, the 3rd grade. And they once again found themselves homeless, but mom was determined to find a spot where she could maybe put her trailer within, and she just kept saying within West Haven school boundaries, which I thought was really empowering. Since they've been to 6 different schools, you know, you think they might want to just return to one of theirs, but I think because they knew that we understood their situation and were there for them as much as we could be.
Yeah, I think that's huge. And I think we've had that happen in several instances where we've had some of our students with the most challenging behaviors that either they move or something happens and they're begging to stay at West Haven. And I think that absolutely goes back to that awareness and the relationships and the things that we've tried to do to connect.
I think the other piece we've seen is, you know, when we have to reach out to a parent or the student knows that they maybe have made another poor choice, everybody sits at the table and when we all know that we're there for each other trying to problem solve. And we're not there to point the finger or say, you need to come and get your child and there's been a big problem. I think that there's almost okay, what are we gonna do here? And we hear more of the parents saying, I'm sorry that this happened, as opposed to, you guys did something wrong.
Yeah.
I don't hear that as often.
Yeah, and they're wanting to work with us usually once they get to know and trust us, because they see that that's the approach, is we're really looking at the need of the child and how to help them versus just trying to get rid of them or something.
Yeah. I think there's been a huge, which is what you hope when you implement trauma-informed, is that there won't be as many suspensions. Because that only makes the student feel more excluded, kind of re-traumatizes them, and so the more that we can keep them at school is definitely helps their self-esteem and ability to regulate and problem solve.
Yeah, and that is one thing we have seen over the last few years, is that reduction in suspension and finding different ways to help meet the student's need or work through it. Complementary to that, I think, is the restorative practice training that we all had the opportunity to have last summer, because then that gives us more tools in our toolbox to help support trauma-informed practices and working with students. Absolutely.
I think they both go hand in hand. And I think the other piece that was just so helpful is Diana Spadek's implementation of the calm boxes in every classroom to help with the regulation. Because that was the other component of trauma-informed, is if you can keep the student in the classroom instead of, again, feeling rejected and that they don't belong. And then just to watch over time, giving some of those students sometimes to regulate. I think really helped them be able to solve their own problems.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was a critical piece and something that we use on a daily basis in most classrooms in the school. That took some time for teachers to feel comfortable with it and be willing, but Diana...
You mean to play with the toys?
Yes. It was good, but Diana kept teaching and pushing that, and now every single teacher has access, every single student has access to tools to help themselves regulate.
Yeah, and I think the other thing with that is sometimes you'll see a student that's utilizing it more than they normally would. And so it's actually ended up being a referral and understanding that that student is having some internal things going on that they hadn't communicated.
Yep.
And instead of acting out physically, they're using the call box more often, but obviously there's something going on there.
And then the teacher cues in like, wait a minute,
Uh-huh.
something must be going on.
So
So,
I've
or
had
might be, not must be, but might be.
Yeah. And so there's been a couple of referrals that way, and it's nice to see that happen versus destruction of property or, again, a suspension because that student has acted out. So I kind of want to go back to making connections with families.
Okay.
And in relation to that, it's connecting to outside resources. And that can be a barrier sometimes if we haven't made that connection with the parent, because we won't have any idea if they have or have not connected to an outside resource, right? That's kind of up on, that's a parent's decision whether they want to share that with us or not. Do you feel like there's been a difference in your ability to gather that kind of information and connect with outside resources with the initial connection with parents?
Yes, absolutely. I think a lot of it comes from, and we're grateful to have the mental health therapists in all of our schools now, because a lot of that comes from the communication and the intakes that you do with parents. I think that a lot of times we can see a need, and I know that you often connect parents to those outside resources, but it's also brought an awareness to me when I'm working with students that, you know, these are some things that would be helpful. These are some things that we need in place. And I know we've referred and worked with some outside agencies specifically on students that we have, you know, identified some trauma in their lives and things that they're struggling with. We have connected them, and I do think that's an important piece.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the one situation we had in the fall with the real disruptive individual that was really struggling in class, and I think it was hard to really imagine the intensity of the destruction of the classroom. And when we look back, and that was again in the fall, the parents kept saying, "Oh, I don't think so. That's never happened at home. We don't have any struggles with our child at home." But as we connected with them and talked with them further, they helped us a lot with the restorative.
Yes.
And they even came in to the classroom and helped address the student apologizing to the classroom and actually to you.
Yeah.
Because in that situation, you had also been sort of the target. But what was helpful, I think, in that situation is they did reach out for some more intensive support, and they were very open.
Yeah, I think that definitely made a big difference. We had this case in the fall with a student who was very physically aggressive, verbally aggressive, destroying the classroom on a daily basis.
And re-traumatizing other students.
Yes.
Some students that were starting to become afraid to come to school.
Absolutely.
Actually,
And staff, it was really difficult for staff. And so we had this piece, and as you said, the parents didn't see that at first, but the more we communicated with them, and not in a, "Oh my gosh, your child did this again, come get him" way, it was like, "Hey, we have got to figure this out together. We're here for you, we're a team, we're going to work on this until we figure it out." And through those conversations, then the parents were able to come around and decide that they were going to seek an outside neuropsych eval, which made a huge difference. I mean, we did a lot of things on our end, but I don't think we would see the success that we saw with this student without that piece on the parents' end.
Absolutely. Now, another question I have with that is, oftentimes when we identify a student that might have a history of trauma, there might be the idea that we don't hold them to the same expectation. That because they're having a hard time regulating, we're just gonna let them take a break and not have to do the work, those types of things. With this individual, were they held to the same expectation as other students?
Yes, and I think it took us a minute to get there, because I think when we don't know how to respond or don't know what to do, sometimes it's easier to look the other way or not follow through or not be consistent. And we've all done it. I've done it sometimes. I'm not sure, so I'm gonna have to deal with that later. However, in this case, when we started to see a difference is when we were able to implement a plan that was consistent, and it was more predictable for the student, it was more
Yes.
predictable for the teacher, more predictable for the parents, more predictable for me in the office. And that, along with the parents' work on the outside, I think is when we saw the biggest shift. And now we basically have zero physical aggression, no classroom destruction. There are definitely still areas of need, and he's not an easy student by any means, but it's night and day different from beginning of year until now.
Yeah, and I think that making some adjustments in the classroom, which was a little bit more predictability and a little bit more consistency in there, which again is a trauma informed. And I think we all say that and know that, but to look at it through a student's eyes, I think that we could all see, but he doesn't know. He kept being fearful that what was going to happen next. And so I think that was a big shift there.
And I think another huge part of that was the support for the teacher in this case.
That's what I was just gonna talk about next, because there's a big concern about secondary trauma.
Yeah.
And how teachers are gonna deal with that. And so I tried to do as much as I could is to do some training on self-care. And how to reach out for support. And I think that is one thing that you do very well at your school is to make sure that teachers can reach out when they are kind of over the limit. Or not sure how to handle a situation. And I think we're trying to be very careful to check in with teachers that might be experiencing some secondary trauma.
And reach out, because in this situation, this is a very veteran, great teacher. I mean, everyone wants to be in her class. She's done a fabulous job, and it was really, really hard on her. And I remember her crying and saying, I feel like a failure. And that was heartbreaking to me, because I know that she's not. She's an excellent teacher, and this was just a tough situation. And so providing her that support and training made all the difference in giving her those tools.
And just working with her and saying, don't take this trauma personal. Don't take this isn't directed towards you. This is an individual that brings some additional challenges, and we've got to just not accept that. But that was a really hard process. But it's nice to hear that is a success now. So that is very nice. I don't
because that's not always the case.
No,
and sometimes I think on the other side of things, we have another situation where there was a lot of support, and some of the same types of things were given to teachers, because this has been going on for a couple of years. We've done the same things. We've reached out to parents. There is that connection there. We've connected them to outside resources multiple times, and they have not followed through. And that has kind of put a big stop or barrier in place for us, because we have done the things that we can do on our end, and we've seen some improvement. We've definitely seen growth.
Absolutely. I think that the emotional regulation has come a long ways.
Huge.
And so I think that is huge. And I think there's been a lot of restorative work done. And, and I think that student has become more accountable and able to talk with peers or adults and say, I just kind of lost it there for a minute.
But then there's still this mental health piece that we're not fully able to meet the need on yet, which makes that be a continued struggle. And so that's hard, and that's sometimes what we see with these cases, because parents don't all have the same capacity or resources.
So let's, in looking at that, what are some barriers in trying to implement trauma-informed? Because when you hear about it, it's like, well, it sounds like it's quite successful. What would be a hard part of implementing it? What are some struggles?
Yeah. There are definitely challenges. I think that the capacity of staff members and the willingness of staff members varies greatly. So some kind of do this naturally and maybe have been doing it, most of their career, might not realize. And then others really struggle with it, or sometimes focus on the punitive side of things. They want the problem solved. They want the student out of their classroom. And not that they're not great teachers, but it's just hard to deal with a student who is disrupting your entire class because you care about all the kids and they're missing out on learning.
Yeah.
So I think addressing that and those continual conversations are a barrier. And that still is a barrier, at West Haven. We've got a wide variety. But I think as a whole, we've improved, and definitely as individuals, we've seen a lot of improvement in this area.
Yeah, I think the hard part too that I've seen a little bit of is we might have a staff or a teacher get triggered in their own previous experience, and we want to be very respectful and understanding of that. And so sometimes that's just really hard. But what I think is important is if the teacher can just say, you know what, this brings me back to such and such and such, and that they're comfortable enough, vulnerable enough to say, this has put me in a spot that is uncomfortable, and I don't know if I can manage this. And so that's another big piece of the education is just letting teachers know that they can communicate that if they need to.
And I think that goes back to the identification piece, because even and to the tie-in with restorative practices, you and I have talked quite a bit about how restorative practices just fit hand in hand with this. And so if a teacher feels comfortable at least with that relationship piece and trying the restorative practice piece, then if there's a part that they don't feel safe with or not comfortable or they're not sure what to do, at least if they can identify that, hey, there's something more underlying, then they can reach out to you or Diana or me.
And I like that because we have identified other people in the building that can maybe be that connection. When it just becomes too hard or too much.